You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Hello, and thank you for joining The American Revolution. This week, episode 351, The First Steps of Ratification. Now, last week we covered the end of the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia in September of 1787. We left off with the delegates signing the draft Constitution and preparing to go home. Before we leave Philadelphia, I want to say a few things about a few parties. The delegates worked 6 days a week during the convention and spent most of their evenings socializing, either in public taverns or at someone's house. Because they had taken an oath of secrecy, they tended to remain with each other in the evenings to talk about various issues at the convention without involving any outsiders. Some delegates, though, would attend outside functions, and as you might guess, George Washington was a particularly popular guest with lots of folks around town. Shortly after arriving in Philadelphia in May, Washington spent time dining with the members of the Society of the Cincinnati, who were wrapping up their national meeting about the time the Federal Convention was getting started. Benjamin Franklin hosted quite a few dinners, as did Robert Morris. Both of these men lived relatively close to the State House and had facilities for hosting pretty substantial dinner parties. We're not sure exactly which one, but it was at one of these dinners that a famous bet took place. Maryland delegate James McHenry recorded an incident at a party toward the end of the convention. Alexander Hamilton was hanging out with Robert Morris and Gouverneur Morris. Hamilton, who had been a close aide to Washington during the war, told the men that Washington never allowed any man to be familiar with him. And by that he meant act in a casual and just friendly way. Gouverneur Morris called BS on Hamilton and said that among gentlemen there was always the ability to be friendly and casual. So Hamilton made a bet with Morris. Quote, "If you will, at the next reception evenings, gently slap him on the shoulder and say, 'My dear General, how happy I am to see you so well.'" Then Hamilton agreed to buy dinner for him and a dozen of his friends. It could be that Morris was hesitant to take the bet until Hamilton said,
"I triple dog dare you!"
A few days later, the men were at a party with Washington. Gouverneur Morris entered, bowed, shook hands, laid his left hand on Washington's shoulder, and said, "My dear General, I am very happy to see you so well." Washington withdrew his hand, stepped suddenly back, fixed his eye on Morris for several minutes with an angry frown, until the latter retreated abashed and sought refuge in the crowd. Hamilton paid off his bet, but Morris later noted his mortification and said that although he had won the bet, he had wished he'd never made it. Now, this is not to say that Washington did not enjoy a good party. The weekend before the convention ended, Washington attended a farewell party at City Tavern thrown by his friends in the Philadelphia Regiment of Light Horse. These were gentlemen who were veteran Continental officers that Washington knew from the war. The bar bill from that party has achieved some fame of its own. According to the bill, the men drank 54 bottles of Madeira wine, 60 bottles of claret, 22 bottles of hard cider, as well as many more bottles of whiskey, beer, punch, cigars, etc. And this is a party with only 55 men in attendance. It meant that multiple bottles of booze for each guest. The bill also included a charge for broken glassware, as well as even more alcohol for the 12 musicians who were hired for the night. The total cost of the party, over 89 pounds sterling. This would be over $20,000 in today's inflation-adjusted currency. Again, for a drinking party for 55 men. A few days later, Washington attended another party at City Tavern following the signing, where the delegates from the convention bade farewell to one another. They did drink, but not nearly as much. With the festivities behind them, the delegates headed home. On the night the final version was signed, printers worked overnight to publish 500 copies of the final document. One of the printers was John Dunlop, who had also printed the Declaration of Independence on the night it was finalized, and who had also attended the party at City Tavern with Washington and the soldiers of the Philadelphia Light Horse. With printed copies in hand on the morning of September 18th, Many delegates headed for home, bringing copies of the Constitution with them directly from the convention to various state officials and other important leaders. Washington personally mailed copies to Thomas Jefferson in France, as well as his old friend the Marquis de Lafayette. Now, even with the convention at an end, Washington observed his promise of secrecy, apologizing to the Marquis that he could not comment on the debates. Washington told his friend that he considered the final product, quote, a child of fortune to be fostered by some and buffeted by others. Washington said he would not say anything for or against it, and simply said the document would speak for itself. With the work complete, Washington wasted no more time in Philadelphia and started his trip home from the convention on September 18th. During his trip home, the weather was really bad, terrible rains, and he was unable to ford a particular river. His coachman attempted to cross an abandoned bridge that was crossing over this flooded river. The bridge collapsed as the carriage was crossing the bridge, sending the carriage crashing into the river. Fortunately, Washington and his traveling companion John Blair had exited the carriage before it attempted to cross this pretty dangerous bridge, so Washington was able to get to the other side and continue home unharmed. Like many, Washington had his concerns about the Constitution. During the convention itself, he had written to Hamilton, who had left for a short time in July, saying, quote, I almost despair of seeing a favorable issue to the proceedings of the convention, and do therefore repent having any agency in the business. By the end of the convention, though, he seemed to believe that it was the best that they were going to be able to do, and that the alternative to ratification was worsening anarchy under the Articles of Confederation. While Washington was not the most outspoken advocate of the final document, he most definitely supported its ratification and privately encouraged others to move forward with making it the basis of the new federal government. The printed copy that was circulated immediately after the convention included the Constitution itself, a letter to the Confederation Congress, and additional resolutions about ratification. All three of these documents were signed by Washington. The convention secretary, William Jackson, carried copies of the documents to New York to deliver to the Confederation Congress. Hopefully all of us are pretty familiar with the preamble to the Constitution, which tries to outline its purpose, but the introductory letter to Congress, which also received a unanimous vote of delegates and was signed by Washington, is often forgotten. I think it gives great insight into the delegates' views on the importance of the proposed Constitution, and it's a pretty short letter, so I'm going to read it here in full. Sir, we have now the honor to submit to the consideration of the United States and Congress assembled that Constitution which has appeared to us most advisable. The friends of our country have long seen and desired that the power of making war, peace, and treaties, that of levying money and regulating commerce, and the correspondent executive and judicial authorities should be fully and effectually vested in the general government of the Union. But the impropriety of delegating such extensive trust to one body of men is evident. Hence results the necessity of a different organization. It is obviously impractical in the federal government of these states to secure all rights of independent sovereignty to each, and yet provide for the interest and safety of all. Individuals entering into society must give up a share of liberty to preserve the rest. The magnitude of the sacrifice must depend as well on situation and circumstance as on the object to be obtained. It is at all times difficult to draw with precision the line between those rights which must be surrendered and those which may be reserved, and on the present occasion this difficulty was increased by a difference among the several states as to their situation, extent, habits, and particular interests. In all our deliberations on this subject, we kept steadily in our view that which appears to us the greatest interest of every true American, the consolidation of our Union, in which is involved our prosperity, felicity, safety, perhaps our national existence. This important consideration, seriously and deeply impressed on our minds, led each state in the convention to be less rigid on points of inferior magnitude than might have been otherwise expected, and thus the Constitution, which we now present, is the result of our spirit of amity and of that mutual deference and concession which the peculiarity of our political situation rendered indispensable. That it will meet with the full and entire approbation of every state is not perhaps to be expected, but each will doubtless consider that had her interest been alone consulted, the consequences might have been particularly disagreeable or injurious to others. That it is liable to as few exceptions as could reasonably have been expected, we hope and believe that it may promote the lasting welfare of that country so dear to us all, and secure her freedom and happiness, is our most ardent wish. The document was then signed by Washington and noted that it was by the unanimous order of the convention. The third document included with the letter and the Constitution itself were the unanimous resolutions of the convention on what should be done with this proposed document. I'm not going to read it all here, but in summary, it resolved that the Constitution should be laid before the Confederation Congress and then submitted to the states. What's interesting here is what it did not say. It did not request that Congress vote on the document, endorse it, or do anything else with it. Congress was to be a simple intermediary to distribute the document to the states. Each state legislature should then call a convention of the people to ratify the document and then give notice to Congress of the state's approval or disapproval. The convention further resolved that as soon as 9 states have ratified the Constitution, that the Confederation Congress should fix a day on which electors appointed by the states should vote for a president. It would be up to the states to schedule elections for these senators and representatives. After the electors voted, they would present these votes to the Confederation Congress, and the Congress would simply hold the votes until the newly elected senators and representatives convened to count the votes and certify the election. At that point, the new government would take the reins of power, and the Confederation Congress would simply dissolve and disappear. Now, it was pretty gutsy that this convention, which had been formed on the premise of recommending amendments to the Articles of Confederation, came back with an entirely new government and even provided instructions on how to bring the new government into existence. It then essentially ordered the Confederation Congress to comply and to destroy itself in favor of this new government implemented on terms spelled out by the convention. It was probably only the fact that the most respected leaders in the country had done this that it was given the deference that it received. That and the national consensus that the Articles of Confederation were failing made its members willing to go along with the convention's resolutions. The Confederation Congress had been poorly attended over the summer, in part due to the fact that nearly 1/3 of its members were serving in the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia. By the time the convention secretary, William Jackson, arrived in New York on September 20th to deliver the Constitution to Congress, 4 of the delegates that had signed the document had already beat him there. More arrived over the next week when Congress began debating what to do with this proposed document. There were only 11 state delegations present. Maryland had only 1 delegate in Congress, and of course 2 were required for the state to cast a vote. Rhode Island, which was the only state not to send delegates to the convention at all, had also not sent delegates to Congress. Rhode Island did send a note to Congress saying that it had refused to send delegates to the convention out of a, quote, fear of making innovations on the rights and liberties of the citizens at large. Delegates to the Confederation Congress were not sure what to do. They had supported the convention to recommend amendments to the Articles of Confederation, but this was not amendments. This was an entirely new document. Further, the document called on the states to ratify it, not the Confederation Congress. Some delegates questioned whether the convention had the authority to do this, whether the Congress needed to do anything at all since the document clearly wasn't asking them to make amendments to the articles. There was some debate as to whether the Confederation Congress should make its own suggested changes to the proposed document before forwarding it to the states. They also had the option to endorse or reject the document in its entirety. James Madison had to rush to New York because the Virginia delegation was evenly divided on whether to even support the Constitution. He was the tie-breaking vote in favor. Madison then fought to shut down proposals to have the Confederation Congress suggest changes to the documents. Many states were already considering the original proposal. If Congress made changes, there would be 2 different documents to consider, making ratification much more complicated. The Constitution was read aloud in Congress on September 20th, the day it arrived. Congress then scheduled a date 1 week later, Wednesday, September 26th, to consider the Constitution. Congress, of course, knew the Constitution was coming. Although the debates at the convention were secret, delegates who served on both bodies made sure Congress had some idea when it could expect the final product. Back in mid-August, the President of Congress, Arthur Sinclair, instructed all states to make sure that they had at least 2 delegates present by September 26th. As I said, Rhode Island, which blew off the entire convention, did not bother to send delegates to Congress, and Maryland was the only other state that did not have at least 2 delegates present. Quite a few of the more active convention delegates who were no longer in Congress also traveled to New York to be part of the discussion. These included Gouverneur Morris and Alexander Hamilton, who both lived in New York, as well as Elbridge Gerry of Massachusetts and John Rutledge of South Carolina. Interestingly, Congress did not record any of these debates. The records for those days simply note that Congress was in session, that there was a motion to transmit the Constitution to the states. Then, on September 28th, the notes reproduce the Constitution itself and the fact that Congress was going to transmit it to the states. Unlike the convention, the Confederation Congress did not usually act in secrecy. Its proceedings were usually covered by the newspapers. Despite the importance of this issue, there were no newspaper reports of the debates. Most of what we know about the debates comes from New York delegate Melancton Smith, who kept notes, and also from letters written by other delegates who were present. But the public at the time remained in the dark. Dissenters in Congress, like Richard Henry Lee of Virginia, argued that it was absurd that Congress could not make any changes to a document that was supposed to be a list of recommended changes for Congress. Lee and Nathan Dane of Massachusetts were 2 of the most outspoken critics in Congress. They saw the convention's legitimacy only as an advisory committee to Congress, not an independent power that was bypassing Congress. To these men, this was a power grab. The articles required that major changes had to be unanimous. This was to prevent sovereign states from being forced to cede power against their will. The convention was now suggesting that a group of 9 states could implement an entirely new government. Even if it wanted to do so, Congress could not endorse this plan unless all 13 states agreed. Given the fact that 10 of the 33 delegates present in New York had also been delegates at the convention, and given the general view that the Confederation Congress was a disaster and that speedy ratification was a necessity, the majority voted not to amend or even debate the contents of the proposed Constitution. This vote, of course, did not come easy and certainly was not unanimous. Nationalists like Madison wanted Congress to endorse the new Constitution. That, of course, brought up the debate that members should be able to criticize parts of the proposed Constitution as well and raise their objections. Lee proposed some pretty popular amendments, like guarantees for freedom of religion and the press, the right to a jury trial and independent judges, restrictions on a standing army in times of peace, protections against excessive bail, fines, cruel and unusual punishment, unreasonable searches and seizures, etc. How could any of these basic protections be objectionable? Why not just add them? No one objected to these protections on the merits, but for the Federalists, making any changes, no matter how agreeable, would just derail the process. Madison compared the convention to another house in government. If the Confederation Congress made changes to the document, then it would have to be resubmitted to the convention. That would, of course, be impossible since the convention already dissolved. Therefore, you'd have 2 versions of this document circulating around for ratification. The convention had hammered out this proposed document through considerable compromises. Unraveling all of that would tear it apart and effectively end this process. Others, like Rufus King, said that they all realized the Articles of Confederation were not working. That's why the states called for this convention in the first place. The states were the sovereign entities that stand for the will of the people. It should be up to the people of the states to decide whether this proposed Constitution, as written by the convention, is worthy of ratification. If the people don't like it, they'll reject it. It's not up to Congress to decide that for them. It's Congress's job to transmit the proposal to the people for their consideration. In the end, a majority of all state delegations present supported a measure to transmit the proposed Constitution to the states without any comments, without any alterations. Total debate over this topic took only 3 days. On September 28th, the Confederation Congress sent the proposed Constitution to the states. At that point, Congress considered its work on the matter complete. Next week, we'll take a look at how the states reacted to this proposed Constitution. Hey, thanks for joining the American Revolution Podcast After Show, part of the Airwave Media Network. Thanks to my Patreon supporters in the Alexander Hamilton Club, George Davis, Mike Hager, John Celentano, Michael Mulhern, and Mitchell Anderson. I also want to thank Robert Morris Circle supporters, TJ Walker, Ron Thorson, and Curtis Johnson. I really do appreciate everyone who supports this podcast through an ongoing contribution on Patreon or through one-time gifts via PayPal or Venmo. You guys really help make all of this possible. Our next live event on Zoom will take place on May 14th, 2025. John Ferling, author of Shots Heard Round the World, will join us to discuss his book. If you'd like to join us live for this event, be sure to sign up for my mailing list or join as a member on Patreon. I usually send out the Zoom link a few days before the events to anyone on either of these lists. Remember that you can join as a free member on Patreon. While you have to be a paid member to get access to the ad-free episodes there, you can join as a free member to get invitations to live events like this one. Now, before we get into our discussion for this week, I have 2 corrections. First, I mistakenly released the last regular episode, 350, as 359. I corrected that typo in the number, but not before thousands of you downloaded the error. It's possible that the error still shows up in some places that have not reproduced the amended episode. If you notice that the feed jumped from episode 349 to 359, don't worry, you haven't missed a bunch of episodes. This is episode 351, and 352 is coming next week. Also, throughout last week's episode, I referred to one of the delegates from Massachusetts as Elbridge Gerry. His last name is actually pronounced Gary with a hard G. I've known about the correct pronunciation for years, but apparently I was having a brain fart last week and forgot about his pronunciation when I was recording the episode. For many years before I learned his correct pronunciation, I had always mispronounced it as Jerry. This is a very common mispronunciation because Gary later had a district drawn for him in the House of Representatives that had weird borders that represented a salamander, and his opponents started calling it a gerrymander, which became the term for districts that are drawn in weird ways to benefit an incumbent or a particular party. So gerrymander uses a soft G, while the person for whom it is named, Elbridge Gerry, uses a hard G. So that is just a frustrating mystery as to why one is pronounced one way and the other pronounced the other way. The bottom line is that his name is correctly pronounced Elbridge Gerry, even though many of us mispronounce it Elbridge Gerry from time to time. This week, we covered a few of the parties that were held around the end of the Constitutional Convention, and then, more importantly, the transmission of the Constitution to the Confederation Congress. It might seem odd that the Confederation Congress would willingly go along with events that were designed to cause its own demise. Delegates did not seem particularly worried about that. And there's good reason. Even if they were thinking about their own careers, they were term limited to 3 years in the Confederation Congress. Most of these delegates in the Confederation Congress expected that they would probably be elected to positions in the new federal House of Representatives or Senate, and those did not have term limits. So while the Confederation Congress might go away, they would have more opportunities for government jobs in the new government. These men, of course, also knew that the Confederation was failing anyway. I think it's overly cynical to think these guys were thinking only about a government position, because positions in either the Confederation Congress or the new Congress really didn't pay that well at the time. Legislators did not receive salaries at this time. They received a per diem for the time that they were actively serving in the legislature, and many complained all the time that the per diem did not even cover their basic living expenses. The real reason that the members of the Confederation Congress supported this was they realized that this was an attempt to make the Union work long-term. So the fact that the convention had exceeded its authority and had made an end run around Congress for ratifying the new government did not seem to bother very many of them. It did bother a minority. There were a great many men who saw this as a counter-revolution. They viewed the Federalist government as a threat to state sovereignty and personal liberty, every bit as much as the British government in London had been. And that's why these people became known as the Anti-Federalists. The Federalist majority, of course, saw a big difference. This federal government was elected by the people. It was not appointed by a king or elected by some foreign body. It was the same self-government the states had always wanted, just on a larger scale. It was an ideological fight between people who saw themselves as part of the 13 separate states that sometimes cooperated, and those who thought they were building a single nation. Now, we'll get into more of those arguments over the next few weeks as we cover these state ratification fights. But I think the introductory letter that I read in the main episode said it all. Those who created and supported the Constitution were realists. They recognized that if the states divided, foreign powers would exploit that division. The phrase, "join or die," was more than just an empty slogan. It meant that we as a people must remain united, despite whatever political, social, or economic differences we may have. Foreign powers have always sought to divide Americans as a way of weakening U.S. power. If the U.S. had failed to become a single nation under the Constitution, it never would have developed into the powerful force for good that it is today. That meant compromise. That meant working constructively with people who held very different political views. That meant realizing there is more that unites us as Americans than separates us. It's a lesson that I hope that we can continue to remember today. My book recommendation this week is The Framers' Coup, The Making of the United States Constitution by Michael Klarman. I found this book interesting. It covers more than the convention itself. It starts with the Articles of Confederation, goes through the convention and through the ratification process. The basic thesis of this book is that the Constitution was effectively a conservative counter-revolution designed to rein in some of the more radical economic policies and what some founders regarded as, quote, excessive democracy that they saw in our post-war Confederation. In short, this book tends to validate the views of the Anti-Federalists. Now, the book definitely has a viewpoint that it's pushing, but I think it is one that's well substantiated by the primary sources that it cites. If you're looking for an objective recitation of historical events, this is probably not the book you want. But I think it does put forward a credible and interesting theory about the creation of the Constitution and is well worth reading. It's a longer book, over 600 pages, nearly 900 if you include the notes and index. The author, Michael Klarman, is a law professor at Harvard University, so university professors tend to drone on quite a bit. The book was first published in 2016. If this sounds interesting, you can get The Framers' Coup, The Making of the United States Constitution by Michael Klarman. My online recommendation is a website that contains Benjamin Franklin's speech at the close of the convention. Franklin is a wonderful wordsmith, and his comments on compromise and the necessity of this document is well worth reading in full. It's only a page and a half long, so don't worry that it's going to take a lot of time. As always, I've included direct links in both my blog and website. I received a question from reporter Anthony this week, which doesn't really have anything to do with history, but I thought some others of you might find it useful. As you know, every week I make a book recommendation. Anthony asked if there was a place where he could find a list of all my past recommendations without having to go through the notes for each individual episode. The answer to that is yes, on my website. I've created 2 public documents there using Google Docs. One is for past book recommendations, and another is for past online recommendations. I don't always encourage people going to my website since it's pretty crudely designed and not something I've bothered to clean up. It's one of those things I've been meaning to get to and keep putting off. But if you go to www.amrevpodcast.com, you get forwarded to my Google Sites page. There you can find my lists of former book and online recommendations. I've also created a list there of every single episode with a direct link to the blog article for that episode, as well as a direct link to an MP3 file for that episode in case you want to download it for some reason. I find these are easier to look up older episodes than using the blog itself or using some other podcast interface somewhere. So if you're trying to find something I've written about in the past, your best bet is to go to www.amrevpodcast.com. If you have a question you'd like me to answer, please reach out to me either via email or on X, Facebook, Quora, or Reddit. Well, that's all for this week. I hope you will join me again next week for another American Revolution podcast.